Thanks, Frederick. Thanks for arranging all of this and inviting me to speak here. All of you for coming here. So I'm going to give a talk I have never given before. Hopefully it will be a talk I may give again. You can let me know what you think afterwards. But it's at a much, as the title says, it's going to be at a much more abstract level than the usual research talk where I dig into a particular domain, and instead give you a sample across quite a number of domains that I've been thinking about, my lab has been working on. So material that you could not get just from reading the papers from my lab, but something more like the discussions that we have nowadays in my lab meeting. So welcome to my lab meeting. This is the topic here. If I can click on this. And people on Zoom can see and hear well, I suppose. Maybe somebody, yes, good, okay, thanks. Okay, want some feedback there. That all works. If for some reason that changes, let me know or put something in the chat and we'll try and correct it. So this is what I'm going to talk about today. Start out with just a broad sort of lay of the land, of at least one way of thinking about what we mean by the mind as scientists, distinguishing that from the way that we might think about the mind as lay people. And then three examples, the first one really brief, and then the other two second one a little more expanded, incorporating work that we've been doing in my own lab that all have to do with the question of how, as scientists, do we approach the mind, which is something we sort of have ready to go in our folk psychology, and there've been a lot of ways of trying to tackle it. One is to just simply take folk psychological concepts and revise them. That would be examples of the first case. Others with topics, constructs like personality or emotion. If I speak to some more reductionist-minded people, like many of my colleagues at Caltech, they will simply say these things don't really exist, and we should get rid of the terms. So they're more eliminativist. And then trying to come around and ask me to what extent I can revise or construct a scientific psychology, and what role might neuroscience data play in that. So it's a broad question that probably all of you have discussed over a beer, or maybe at a live meeting, but maybe not in a more formal setting. So one other thing I want to convey here is just that I think it's actually important to do this and to ask these high-level questions. If you're a cognitive psychologist or a cognitive neuroscientist, you don't need to be a card-carrying philosopher, but it's actually important to debate these questions at some depth, and I'll give you some flavor for the debates and disagreements. So here's one way of starting then. I'm going to just, for the first couple of slides, you could think of these as a warm-up. And I think most of you will probably nod and say this is obvious, and you might agree with this. But it turns out it's not obvious when it comes down to it. So later on, when we dig into some of the details, certain assumptions that we have about the mind tend to creep in, and they cause difficulties if you don't keep these distinctions clear. So the first, if you ask the person on the street, right, they will think of the mind as being very closely connected with conscious experience. And of course, that's how a lot of people, and probably the modal view for philosophers, it's certainly one view. I don't know if it would be the view for most psychologists or neuroscientists. So that's one view, which we haven't to first order studied at all. So that my lab doesn't presume to try to study consciousness per se. And so if we're, to the extent that we're studying the mind, we're not studying the first. I'm not looking at consciousness studies. The second one we have studied a lot, and I could give a talk just on that topic. And it's an interesting topic, which is essentially how do people think of minds, average people, theory of mind, mentalizing, social inference, everything we're doing right now, right? So you would, unless you're really steeped in some strange philosophy or very scientific, even in everyday life, you construct a representation of what I'm feeling, what I'm thinking, what kind of person I am, from looking at my face, what I'm seeing, etc. So these are the kinds of studies where we show pictures of faces to people on a screen, studies we've collaborated with Frederick on, for example, and ask which features of a face convey information from which we would infer that the person has a particular emotional state or a particular personality trait, etc. So again, this is a big topic that we do study in the lab, but not the one for today's lecture. So today's topic is this one, which is how should we as scientists think about the mind broadly. And the claim is that you don't want to think about it this way. Unless you take yourself to be a consciousness researcher, then sure, you present at ASSC and you're doing studies explicitly on consciousness. But if you're not doing that, then I would propose you bracket that because it causes problems. And we're also not, at least again, to first order here, thinking about how people normally construe the mind. But the answer would be that as scientists, so here's the thought experiment, right? Imagine that you are intelligent aliens coming to Earth for the first time, and you see all these humans and other animals moving around, complex behavior, and you create a science to explain that behavior. If you don't have the concept of consciousness in the first place, you're not going to have that in there at all. And you're going to come up with some science that presumably provides a causal explanation of the behavior. And if you have neuroscience data available and you can crack open these organisms moving around, you would look at the internal mechanisms and would have some neuroscience as well. So that's it. That's, very basic. Again, I think you would find yourself in agreement with all of this, but the problem is, at least for many of the domains, like for instance, emotion, that my lab works on, many colleagues nod and say, yes, I agree with all of this, but then at some point they do bring in consciousness. And they say, well, what really grounds it is what people say about how they feel. And then you've brought in consciousness, and that's a problem. So this is the basic setup. And you would imagine then constructing in the simplest case, something like a boxes and arrows architecture that would have psychological variables, attention, decision making, memory, emotions, etc., in there that provide an explanation of the humans or the animals' behavior. But there are at least two challenges then, if you think about it that way. One is what to put in the boxes to begin with. And in general, what we have put into them is continuous with folk psychology. So the reason you can understand what cognitive psychologists or cognitive neuroscientists talk about when they talk about memory or decision-making or emotion or personality or intelligence is because all these words already exist in English. They existed well before we had a science that looked at them. And the problem then, of course, is there's a whole bunch of historically entrenched baggage. They're connected with folk psychology. You could do that. You could try to just start with the brain. You could try to start with behavior. There have been, of course, famous historical movements that have tried to do that, not with that much success. And then the other question is, if you have boxes and arrows, assume you have figured out what the psychological variables should be to put into the boxes. What are the arrows? And that's another big question that keeps coming up. In particular, do they denote causal or constitutive relationships? So do you have arrows that go from intelligence or personality to attention, memory, or some performance task? Or is intelligence just the whole thing taken together? Is it constitutive or causal? And there's ways of addressing these, but let me just continue quickly to just give you more of a flavor of the picture of the mind to begin with that I have in mind here. So here's the idea. These are data from the Human Connectome project. I'll show you more data in a minute on several topics. Usually, mostly you see data that actually look somewhat similar to this, that are correlations between brain activation, resting state data, and so forth. These are not. These are behavioral data. So there's 1,000 subjects or so in the Connectome project. They all got scanned, and we have brain data. I'll show you some analyses of that a little later. But in addition, we have data across many different tasks. And the HCP isn't the only data set like that. There's a number like that nowadays. But what I want to point out here is the correlation structure across these 1,000 subjects on these tasks. So 1,000 subjects took personality questionnaires. They did a whole bunch of cognitive performance tasks. They rated how badly they felt and how good they felt, okay? And you see the correlation structure, which is what the colors here denote, pretty much makes sense. So red means there are positive and blue, there are negative correlations. So for instance, across all of the questionnaires that assess how bad you feel, anxiety, depression, kinds of questionnaires, they're positively intercorrelated. On average, if you feel bad in one way, you feel bad in a bunch of other ways. And they're negatively correlated with the positive affect ones. One thing that you see here is that the cognitive tasks are all intercorrelated with one another. And again, from that, you would derive that represents what Spearman called the positive manifold. And you can derive with a factor analysis from this fluid intelligence, Spearman's G. This basically just says those people that are better at memory tasks on average are also better at attention tasks and reaction time tasks and lots of other tasks. Why? Because they're just smarter. So you have a structure right in here. And the thought then is that this is a toy. So these data are real on the left, but this is a toy example. We don't have proposed to have a full model, but the idea would be that you would then want to construct a model that in the simplest case would look like this. You would put variables in these boxes, and you would have causal relations between them, so that you would have somebody's trait variables, personality or intelligence, all these different state variables, and then the measured variables, which are the ones whose correlation we see over here. So you could think of this on the right as a generative model that produces the data that shows the correlation structure on the left. So if you expanded this, if we had a complete behavioral assessment of a person, all possible tasks in the wild, in nature, in the lab, everything, all domains assessed, right? We should derive some kind of complete cognitive architecture from this. That's the picture, right? The reason that this should make, I hope, intuitive sense to you is because it actually corresponds to our folk psychological way of thinking about the mind. So this is the so-called 3D mind model from Mark Thornton and Diana Tamir, which says, well, this is exactly what you do in everyday life, not as scientifically as what I just showed you, but same thing. You observe actions and behaviors of people, and then you infer their states and their traits and relations between those. So I'm going to elaborate on this. The details are irrelevant, but that's the basic idea. We infer some model, both as lay people and as scientists, to explain observed behavior and the structure and the correlations in that behavior. Just unpacking this a little bit more then. So the claim is that these psychological variables are in the brain. So personality is, I'll elaborate on this in a few slides, literally in the brain, in the sense that it depends on or supervenes or is realized in the brain, and ditto for everything else psychological. And these are constituted, these psychological variables are constituted by things in the brain, but they cause the behavior. So the questionnaire reports on personality questionnaires or performance from which you can infer intelligence. So these tests, again, are from what we use these to infer the psychological variables. We have other data from which we can infer the psychological variables these days, which is the brain measures. So it's exactly the same relation. The brain activity also causes patterns of covariation in bold fMRI. We can use that. We can use that across the 100 subjects. And you would expect, and I will show you as the case, many people have shown this, that indeed, from the brain data, you can predict the behavioral data because they have a common cause. They both arise from the brain, which is where these psychological variables actually live. Okay, so I'm going to whiz through the first sort of example here because I'm assuming it's all relatively familiar to you. If not, nothing else depends on it. But the first one is not from my own lab, it's just one example I picked because it happens to be about emotion from Rebecca Sachs and colleagues at MIT, somewhat dated paper, but it makes the point that you can use neuroscience data, of course, to adjudicate between competing psychological theories. And there's many different ways of doing that. But in this case, they looked at the similarity structure using representational dissimilarity analysis of the psychological, the behavioral derived data and the brain data. So let me just walk you through quickly what they did here. I think you'll get the sense, even glossing over the details. They chose a bunch of emotions, 20 in this example. Of each emotion, they had multiple instances that are conveyed by text in this particular study. So you read a little story that, and then are asked to judge how the person in the story feels. And it can be apprehensive or furious or joyful or so forth, 17 other emotions. They then had people rate these emotions according to 3 competing psychological models of how emotion is represented. So the simplest one is just what psychologists call affect, 2 dimensions. Is it pleasant or unpleasant? It's valence. And how arousing is it? That's it. This one, probably the most popular one, at least over the last several decades, proposes there are about 6 or so basic emotions. And again, you rate each of these instances of the stimuli on these 6. And then this one, this appraisal one, is the most elaborate. There's 38 different features that you rate these emotions on. So here you have all of these stimuli represented in a 2-dimensional, 6-dimensional, or 38-dimensional psychological space from the ratings that people just give when they think about these stimuli. And then they also had people read these but not rate them while in the scanner. And there they looked at the multivoxel pattern of activation across voxels in a region of the brain. What they then did is to compare these to, and this has, as you no doubt will be thinking, lots of assumptions behind it. But the idea is to the extent that any one of these three competing psychological models fits the brain data less well or better, that's an argument that that's evidence in favor of that psychological model. So that's exactly what they did. You have 2, 6, 38-dimensional vectors from the ratings of all of these little stories by people. And then you have a 100 or more dimensional vector for each of them corresponding to the pattern of activation in the brain across 100 little voxels in this yellow part of the brain. Okay, clear so far? And then all you do is you simply construct a similarity matrix. So these are triangle symmetric matrices that show you the similarity between the stimuli in these spaces. So you take all of these vectors and you correlate them. All the vectors corresponding to all of the stimuli on the X and the Y axis. And what you find in the psychological spaces is exactly what you might expect. So all the negative ones, all the bad, negatively valenced emotions clustered together, and all the positive ones clustered together. But there's also some differences, and then the brain data are more complicated. And then you can compare these similarity matrices and ask, how does the brain data compare to each? So here, very simple example of using, maybe not simple, but common example of using brain data to try to adjudicate amongst competing psychological theories. And in this one, they found the claim is that this 38-dimensional one is better supported. There's lots of worries under the hood here that I won't get into. The noise ceiling is terribly low, and these are not very compelling data, but the basic approach hopefully makes sense. That here you're using the similarity structure in a behaviorally derived psychological space, and again, with competing models and brain data to adjudicate between these models. The other one that I did for the last 30 years or so of my career, and really started my career when I was a postdoc at Iowa, was to look at dissociations, which are easiest to get in patients who have brain damage of certain sorts. And so again, here just one very quick example of glossing over making the same point. We have a theory, we have a view from psychology already. We're asking, can we revise this, or can we adjudicate between different theories? In this particular one, we have 6 basic emotions, and we have the emotion of fear, whichever one this one, I guess, is fear, this little character, that lots of work from lots of people had linked to a particular brain structure, the amygdala, which is what I focused my postdoctoral and junior faculty work on. And we had a patient who had lesions of the amygdala and very selective impairment in fear across many, many different tasks, Pavlovian fear conditioning, recognizing fear, facial expressions, and experience of fear. This is her here. We took her, did many, many experiments, but we took her to a place with big spiders and poisonous snakes and documented that, like in monkeys with amygdala lesions, you find a striking dissociation that she seems not to be able to recognize or experience fear, but other emotions normally. So in this current biology paper, we took her to a haunted house at Halloween, took her to these snakes and spiders. We showed her horror movies. The gray bars are the amount of fear endorsed by control participants, as M is in black, basically reports feeling no fear. And in everyday life, we had her fill out a questionnaire, or the PDA, of how much she would experience all these emotions. She says she experiences all of them, except fear, again, is just totally drops out. So it certainly looks like there's a module actually in the brain, evidence that the spoke psychological category, fear, is in fact the scientific category that we should use. And we summarized a lot of the evidence here in the book that we edited, me and David Amaral, some years ago. But it turns out that the story is more complicated, and the concept of fear that we had to begin with could be refined. And that's how most people think of it now. For example, we took SM and there's my pointer, and 2 other patients who also had amygdala lesions. And rather than inducing fear with snakes and spiders, we had them inhale carbon dioxide, which induces a panic attack. You feel like you're suffocating in many cases. And what we found there is that indeed these patients all had panic attacks. Let me just jump to the main data here. If you just look at this left plot, it shows the percentage of panic attacks when they inhale carbon dioxide. In comparison subjects, about a quarter of you would have a panic attack if you inhaled carbon dioxide. All of the amygdala patients had a panic attack on many different dependent measures. So here we have a dissociation between, on the one hand, recognizing fear and inducing fear, all the autonomic and experiential components of fear, from exteroceptive stimuli, snakes, spiders, haunted houses, and from an interoceptive stimulus, your sense of suffocating or having a heart attack or something like that. They are not the same. They depend on different neural structures, and you can dissociate them here in this case. I'm just showing you a simple dissociation of double dissociation, but still it makes the same point. So here we have an example of fractionating a concept, folk psychology, fear, in a more fine-grained way, given the scientific data. So fear, anxiety, panic are often distinguished these days in scientific studies, in good part because their neural substrates are distinct to some extent. So I take it this part that I just whizzed through pretty quickly here is fairly uncontentious. We have a lot of, pretty much all of our current psychology uses concepts that derive from the folk psychology, but everybody would agree we shouldn't stop there, and we can refine them. We can fractionate them into subtypes. We can revise them to some extent. It gets more complicated with some of these psychological variables, like the three listed here, because many people would say, well, there's nothing, you can't fix these. These are not to be revised. You need to just get rid of them. They're too vague, or they just don't fit into a science. So let me walk you through some of the studies that we did here. So again, coming back to the Human Connectome project, for personality, we did a study where we looked at that data set, and we have for the behavior, people's personality available from the standard 5-factor personality inventory, extroversion, conscientiousness, and so on. So that's the behavioral data. And we also have the brain data. Again, it's the same as what I showed you last time, so I probably don't need to reiterate this, but the resting state data that we used looks at the correlations between all the different regions or parcels of the brain from which we extract the time course at rest. So you have about 30 minutes, people lie in the scanner, they're not doing anything. We parcelate the brain into a bunch of parcels, and we extract the time course, these squiggly lines from each of those, and just build a big correlation matrix. And then you do lots and lots of other processing to denoise that and so forth. But the bottom line is you have a correlation matrix for subject 1, for subject 2, for subject 3. You simply linearize that correlation matrix, or half of it, everything under the diagonal, because it's triangle symmetric. And so what you have here is subjects, and each subject has a big vector, all the edges in your correlation matrix. Again, the details really don't matter here. And then you just build a big regularized regression model where you ask, given these brain data, can I predict the personality data in our case? So two data sets. Personality of the subjects, here's their distribution in the Human Connectome project. So they were all pretty open, conscientious, extrovert, and not very neurotic. Good. Was selected to be normal, healthy, happy subjects. But the behavioral data on the one hand, and then we have the functional imaging data on the other hand. And coming back to this picture, we're now asking from the functional imaging data, can we build a model that would predict the personality? And we do the usual things, leaving subjects out, cross-validating, et cetera, et cetera. And what we found is that, well, sort of, but only weakly. So some of these, in particular, openness to experience, we could weakly predict from the brain imaging data, and some not at all. Not obvious what to conclude from that, because there could be many reasons for this negative finding. But one conclusion we had was that this one had a more useful neural correlate, at least in terms of predicting it across subjects. So very quickly, just this is not, it's relevant, but it's not super relevant for the talk here to orient you to how this is represented. This shows the strength of the correlation between what my model predicts and what the actual personality score of a held out subject was. And so the higher this is, the better the model. The gray region is what you would get by chance. So if you just permute your data, you get something in the gray region. So you want to be outside the gray region. And then it also has a replication built in, because everybody in the Human Connectome project had 2 resting state data sets, about half an hour each. And so this is resting state data. This is a model, and everything fitted to resting state data set 1, and then the same thing for resting state data set 2. So you would expect that to the extent that this replicates, these dots should fall across the diagonal. all the different colors and shapes here are different ways of analyzing the data. So as you probably know, one big issue under the hood here is that this depends totally on how you do it. And so we parcellated the brain in different ways, aligned it in different ways, denoised it in different ways, and used different models. That's what all the different dots are. In the best case, right, you can predict it significantly. So you're way up here. All the dots cluster together. It doesn't make any difference how you analyze it. And it replicates across rest 1 and rest 2. So you have the whole cluster here. You can see it's much more spread out. There's some evidence for openness, less so for neuroticism. So that's the brain imaging data. You might think for personality, this is besides the point, and that actually personality should be defined on the basis of the behavior, and it's not in the brain. It's actually literally either in the behavior itself, whatever that means, or it's some kind of construct from the behavior. But the brain data are not part of it. I'll come back to that in just a second. And so people have done that, again, without going into detail, in exactly the way that you would imagine, that you could imagine doing this with humans. You take a bunch of mice in this, I think it was mice, maybe rats, in this study, and you put a video camera up and they move around, and you just annotate how often they interact, how shy they are, all these different things over many days. And then in this particular study here, they derived an a priori metric of a definition of personality. So rather than saying, well, we take the Neo 5-factor inventory, which is 100% derived from folk psychology. It's from a lexical analysis of the words that people use to describe personality. Here, you're a mathematician and you say, on first principles, what do I mean by personality? And this is much more satisfying, right? So let me just tell you what it is. It's fairly intuitive, which is that you want to look at the variability across individuals, and you want to maximize that. So my personality should be distinct from Frederick's. It should be what makes us different persons. On the other hand, the variability within a subject across time should be very small. I should be the same person from week 1 to week 2 and week 3. So you want something that is temporal, that has very small within subject variability and very large between subject variability. So that's what that's the metric that they're optimizing here. Maximize the between subject variability and minimize within subject variability. And when you do that, you get these factors that in their paper, they were tellingly careful not to use the word personality, but they call them identity domains to make sure they didn't get any personality reviewers for the paper. But this is what you would get just based on behavior. So we took up, given this, you could ask the question that I already alluded to before, which we did in this paper that took about 3 years to get published, which is just conceptual, which is asking, well, so where is personality? What is it? Some of the reviewers said it's everywhere. In particular, personality is in your genes, it's in your environment, it's in the brain, and it's in behavior. It's all the whole thing, which doesn't seem very useful to me. It seems to me that some of these arrows, for some reason I'm having a hard time getting my point. Some of these arrows, well, all of those are causal, and that personality shouldn't be in the whole thing, but it should be in only one of them. One of the reviewers, Tal Yarkoni, actually, was very, very insistent. We had a lot of problems with him. He said, this is insane. Personality is obviously only in behavior, nowhere else. That's it. It's just behavior. It's a mathematical construction just from patterns of behavior. To which we replied, okay, here's the experiment. You take a person and you paralyze them, or they have locked-in syndrome. The behavior is gone. Have you erased their personality? And the very strong intuition would be no. They still have the same personality. They just can't express it, right? So again, we made the argument that personality is in the brain and causes the behavior for which you can infer it, but it's not literally in the behavior. And as the locked-in syndrome case just shows, you can design experiments to tell these apart. And then once you go into the brain, where we have a bunch of studies going on as well, you can carry the same exercise through. You could say personality, just, it's like the person's axons are more myelinated, or they have different types of neurotransmitter globally, and everything, motivation, emotion, all of everything in psychology is affected by the personality. That's just what the personality is. It's a bias across everything. That's one possibility. in which case it's impossible to dissociate personality from the other variables. If I have a brain lesion that changes your personality, as happens in some cases of frontal lobe lesions, I should change everything about your psychology. The alternative would be to have personality be one, one module here, maybe in a hierarchical relation to the others, but in principle dissociable. Okay? So anyway, you get the point. There are lots of, once you start thinking about it, there's lots of debates for sure. But then if you have a model like this, you can actually think of designing experiments analogous to the lesion case that I showed in the case of fear that could dissociate and distinguish between those. One problem that we ran into in our one, along the same lines, one challenge that we ran into in our study of using the Human Connectome project data to look at personality, and one reason I think we got such weak findings is the problem that, at least as measured with the standard tests, and that's a big caveat, personality is correlated with a lot of other stuff. So here's an this is a little dense, but let me just point out one. This is openness to experience, one of the personality dimensions here, measured with a five-factor inventory. And this red square, this 0.2 or whatever it is, correlation. So there's a good correlation with another task, which measures fluid intelligence, Raven's progressive matrices. And so we regressed that out in our analysis, but we were worried about doing that. We regressed out all of these other things because we thought they were confounds. But you might think, well, maybe not. Maybe intelligence, at least as measured with this task, actually shares variance, is constitutive of this particular personality. And if you regress all these things out, you're not going to have anything left eventually because you've removed all the variance of interest. You've thrown out the baby with the bathwater. So that's one, when you actually do the experiments, you could have the models along the lines of what I just showed you, but the problem is you can't cleanly test them because your tasks that you use are contaminated. They aren't pure measures of intelligence. The measure of intelligence and personality, reaction time, and a whole bunch of other things needed to perform the task. And if you regress them out, you're going to not have any variability left for your task of interest. So the next one, I don't know if these all get more challenging or less, but the next one we did, I'll go through it quickly. Exactly the same setup, same set of authors. Julien Dubois, who's now the chief scientific person at
Can I ask a quick question?
Yes.
Sorry, this the one before?
The one before. Yes.
So this type of situation, do you sometimes try something like a PCA, principal component analysis, to get maybe the one or the two, and then there you have weights, and then you can trace back the contributions maybe of these components as a way to disambiguate maybe more. You
can, yeah, you can do a variety of things to try and clean things up and try to be more or less conservative about removing variants that you think you might be interested in. If you just do PCA on the full thing, of course, what you'll get is not the original personality factors, but something else. And then you have to convince reviewers that these are actually about personality. They'll say, well, I don't know what exercise you just did, but we know what personality is. Here's the test. And now you're giving me something else from PCA analysis. I don't care. And so we didn't do that.
But the loadings of the PCA, the weights of the different variables here, you can find them in the PC component that will explain
yes.
Solutions, and then
but yes, but you're just saying, residualize this one here with respect to all of these others.
Right.
And again, the problem is then the more others you have, the less variability you would have that's unique to your personality dimension of interest. So it still comes, you don't get around it. It still comes, you can keep going in that direction. So certainly if you just did a purely data-driven dimensionality reduction, just PCA on everything, you could take a look at the PCs and interpret them, and to the extent, that they really fit and make sense in terms of a personality dimension, then you would be justified in using it. And then, of course, you would be done because by definition, the PCs are all orthogonal to one another. So that's good. Yeah. Okay, so the next one is intelligence. Same authors, Julien Dubois, who was a postdoc at the time in my lab, did pretty much all the analyses here. And now for intelligence, same setup. We have the Human Connectome project, we have intelligence measures, and we have resting state functional connectivity, just like I showed you for personality. Here, we took what is advertised as a test of fluid intelligence, which is Raven's progressive matrices. You've probably seen things like this or tried to take them online to see how smart you are, right? It's the standard. You see this with the third one. You see this with the third one. You see this, you see this. Which of the ones below goes as the third one, right? So it doesn't help you to know a lot of semantic knowledge about the world. I've read the news. It's very flexible kind of reason that people often use as a measure of intelligence. So we did that. Here's the result, exactly the same analysis as before. And again, to remind you, we want to be out of this gray area. So we're statistically significant with respect to permutation distribution, somewhere up here. We would like to replicate across the two rests. So we're going to fall across the diagonal. And ideally, all these different colored dots that are different ways of analyzing the data in the detail should cluster together so it doesn't make a difference. Well, it does make a difference, of course, and there was some interesting recommendations, for instance, how to co-register the brains and what parcellation to use, etc. But it's much better than the personality, but still not particularly good. What we did next was to say, well, that's not how Spearman would have done it. Spearman would have derived from a factor analysis intelligence across all of the different tasks, right? The positive manifold that I showed you before, where we had this picture, all the performance tasks, attention, memory, everything that people did here, are positively intercorrelated. You could use that and do a hierarchical factor analysis to derive a factor that all of these share in common. And that's what Spearman's G is. We did that. These subjects had all these tasks available in the HCP, and you do much better. That's above 0.4. It's this yellow dot up here. So what this seemed to suggest to us that a couple of things. One is that the brain imaging data are actually, we used to think all of this was limited for the crappiness of the fMRI data to begin with. It has really poor signal to noise, etc. That wasn't the limiting factor. The behavioral task was in this particular case. And if you just had a more accurate, better bound on your errors on your measure of intelligence, as with the hierarchical factor analysis, you could actually do surprisingly well here. And it supported then the idea that whatever it is that this statistical analysis, hierarchical factor analysis that Spearman would have done, that is closer to, or indeed by definition, a metric rather than just a measure of fluid intelligence. Whereas Raven's progressive matrices is not, it's a noisy measure, right? Okay, so let me skip this part for the sake of time. We should stop around shortly after 4, something like that.
Usually can go over.
Okay. I'm at slide 54 of 94, so.
You'll have to come back.
So I just want to give you a flavor for the many ways in which each of these could be a story in its own right, but they share a lot in common, and it's fun to abstract across to look at the conceptual issues. We've approached intelligence in another way. One reason that these fMRI studies are unsatisfying in many ways, that of course they're just correlational. It's difficult to have sort of strong causal claims from those. And everything's kind of correlated with everything. So it's difficult to get anatomical specificity, at least from these resting state data. So I have been, still am, collaborating with the University of Iowa, where they have patients with lesions all over the brain. So there you can have a more neuroanatomically precise story of which regions, when damaged, cause impairments in a particular task. These hot colors are the distributions of the density of the lesions of a couple of hundred patients. They now are up to 1,000 patients who have focal lesions in different parts of the brain. They don't sample everything. They certainly don't sample the brain homogeneously. Lesions are more common in regions where you have blood vessels, like the middle cerebral artery, where you might have a stroke. You can correct for that. But again, you have now a database where rather than looking at activation, as in the fMRI studies, you can ask, when I have lesions in a certain region, what's the consequence on a particular task? And we looked at that for the Wechsler Adult Intelligence scale. Also, we parsed it into the different index scores. I'm going to skip this slide and just go to this one. So in this study with my former postdoc, Jan Glescher, who's now faculty in Hamburg in Germany, this was what we got. These hot colors show that these are the regions in the brain, when you have a lesion there, impair general intelligence. And so, or full scale IQ and general intelligence. We looked at both of these in here. So they're not everywhere. They're in certain regions of the brain, and in particular, they're regions that connect processing that is in the right and in the left hemisphere. So you have to do both together, and that was in line, or is in line, with one of the leading theories of intelligence, the frontoparietal integration theory, which basically says that for general intelligence, you need to integrate for processing that's to some extent modularized in anatomical regions that are in different parts of the brain and different hemispheres. So it supported that. This was also difficult to publish for reasons like this one. So after various reviews, I will read it to you quickly so you get the conceptual point. The editor of the paper, member of the National Academy of Sciences, says, third, I'm even more confused than reviewer two and want to know what it means to try to find the neural basis of something that does not actually exist. The statistical construction G, which is Spearman's G, general intelligence, is an ontological problem that I think needs discussion. General intelligence simply does not have the status of concepts like short-term working memory or depth perception, so I'm not at all sure where you're trying to start its neural basis. So these are the kinds of arguments and discussions we've had with people that, well, we would say it's in the brain, like all psychological variables, and here's some evidence for where it might be located in the brain. But we have people pushing back, saying this doesn't make any sense at all. And in fact, it's pointless to try to have neuroscience studies because this is just a mathematical construct, and that's it. So we have gone further since then. We've done other studies. This is a more recent one where we had an even larger sample of 400 subjects, brain lesions, same thing. Same approach. We derive Spearman's G from a factor analysis across all of these tasks. And in this particular study, we identified general intelligence with one of its sub-factors, which is working memory. But the analysis was very detailed, and the argument we make, it's an embellished version of what I already told you, is that yes, it's in the brain, and it's in the brain in such a way that it actually gives you some insight and supports something about how it works, which is that you need to connect many different types of processing, visuospatial processing, lexical processing, all need to be brought together. And so the place where you have the greatest deficit when you have a lesion is not in gray matter, but in white matter that connects all of these different regions. So here you would actually have the strong argument saying you have a functional description or statistical construct G, but it has certain operating characteristics. It allows you very flexibly to be smart in many different domains. What does that require? It requires, if it's implemented in the brain, it requires that you actually need to communicate between different brain regions. So if you were a philosopher, functionalist, which I am, you would say that in principle, all of these psychological variables could be multiply realized in the brains of humans, animals, maybe robots. But this actually says yes, but not arbitrarily so. So it might not be uniquely realized, but it's realized in a way so that the actual physical, biochemical, computational properties of the realization meet the processing demands of whatever your construct is. It can't just be anywhere in the brain. In this case, it has to be in white matter because it serves the function of communicating between different processing in different regions. Let me go to the next one, which has been the topic that my lab has worked on the most, and the most challenging one, which is emotion. I'm going to skip this here and start here. So let's take up time. Emotion is even harder because there, if you talk to people and if you talk to emotion researchers and ask them, well, what is an emotion? You really get no consensus at all. For personality, at least, they have the scales to show you. For emotion, they can't even agree on what the emotions should be. So there's really a lot of disagreement. One way of motivating it is as follows, which is what would you need to control behavior if you think very broadly in an evolutionary and developmental context? The simplest ones would be controls of behavior that are extremely narrow and rigid. That are basically reflexes, right? So like the knee-jerk reflex, there's only a particular narrow kind of input, tapping the patellar tendon in my knee, and only a particular type of output. My knee jerks and nothing else happens, right? There's no effects on memory or attention or decision-making. It's just a local thing. If you go to controls of behavior across this hierarchy, let's put the whole thing up, you can very roughly sketch these controllers in terms of ones that are very stimulus coupled and narrow, so super modularized, right, reflexes, to ones that are not, and they're completely decoupled from the stimuli. And this would be most of your volitional behavior that you base on just your beliefs and thinking about what to do next, what exam to study for. These are very, very decoupled from the stimuli that cause them, and very open and non-modular. And so the thought is emotions are in the middle. They accomplished what a whole bunch of reflexes could no longer do, which is that they're more flexible and they can take varied inputs, the snake or the spider or the haunted house or any number of stimuli that signal potential threat. And then they can trigger not just a knee jerk, but you running away and your heart rate changing and your blood pressure changing and your attention and your memory and decision-making effects, again, very globally. So they're kind of in the middle. The thought is that they evolved to regulate behaviors to recurring, patterns or packages that were like threats, but much more flexible than reflexes. So an example would be this, right? If you looked at this just introspectively, and I could measure it, if I hooked you up and measured your heart rate or your blood pressure, if this flashes up, in general, you'll have some emotional reaction, maybe not too differentiated, but the point is that you can't help but have some emotional reaction to that particular stimulus. So maybe not all of you are familiar with, or certainly don't buy into any notion of modularity, but if you map this onto the sort of classic, Jerry Fodor criteria for a module, emotions are strongly domain specific. So there's only particular types of input. If I just show you any picture, it doesn't do it. If I show you a text description, if I give you a lexical description of the dog, it doesn't do it either, unless you conjure up an image. Test that. So strongly domain specific. They're very weak. They're basically not penetrable. So they satisfy that criteria of a module. Just like optical illusions, even when you know it's an illusion, you can't help, or hearing speech right now, right? You can't just, unless you're really not very good at English, right? You can't just hear that as a bunch of auditory patterns. You hear it as language necessarily. Same here. Even once you know it's just a picture of a dog on the screen, you still have an emotional response. So anyway, so you could come up with a bunch of criteria. There are these controllers for behaviors that you could tell a story in terms of evolution, and they have certain criteria, certain operating characteristics. And this guy, David Anderson, and I, my colleague at Caltech, then spelled out sort of in more detail, they have to persist for some time to integrate information. You could come up with a list of operating characteristics for emotion, which we did in this book that we wrote a couple of years ago. David Anderson works on emotions, he would say, in flies and in mice. So he looks at very detailed neural circuits. And in his papers, he probably doesn't necessarily use the word emotion, but if you ask him, he would insist that he studies emotions in all of these, including flies. Anyway, so he and I got together to write this book. So the thought is very, again, you should agree with this initially, but many people don't. The thought is very simple. There's an essential emotional state, which has these various operating characteristics, and it causes all of these from which we can infer the emotional state. I can hook you up to, a polygraph. I can measure changes in your blood pressure and heart rate. I can measure changes, which is important, on lots of cognitive processes. Emotions would influence decision-making and attention and memory. I could ask you for how you feel, and that would again be a causal consequence of the emotion. They can make you conscious of something that you can report on. And of course, I can look at your facial expression, observed behavior, etc. By contrast, here's a popular view that Jim Russell, and also the person with whom I've debated this the most, Lisa Feldman-Barrett, subscribed to, that basically completely turns this around. So rather than having the emotion causing all of these dependent measures from which I could infer emotion as a latent variable in the brain, they would say, no, there are all these different things. And what they do is they just cause a concept of an emotion. Here's the quote, I'll just read it for you. There's no need to postulate a mechanism that ties all these various components of emotion into one package. Emotions are coherent packages, not because they stem from one mechanism, but because they're just selected by an observer based on a folk concept. So they say this is completely socially constructed, that you can talk about emotions, we construct them. There's no mechanism, there's nothing in the brain. It doesn't make sense to look for emotions. So totally different viewpoints. And I've argued, in fact, with Lisa Feldman Barrett in this first series of papers and a whole bunch of other papers against this. The main problem is that pretty much all of the psychology on emotion are studies from humans giving self-reports. And studies in animals would take a very different tack, similar to what we saw with the personality case. And the problem is they conflate these different entities here. So the emotion state is just the central state that's realized in the brain that would have certain operating characteristics for controlling behavior. So it's just what aliens coming down would postulate, I think, in their mature scientific but alien psychology, to give a compact, useful scientific explanation of complex behavior. The emotion experience is, I don't know exactly what that is, but it's what people say they feel when they have an emotion. And of course, in general, if you ask people, about give me any dependent measures on emotion, come up with a theory for emotion. What do? Well, they select as instances for their theory all those samples to which they have access, which are their conscious experiences of the emotion. What else? And so it's a big problem because people conflate the experience with the state. And then finally, in humans, presumably animals have both the state and I think they have conscious experiences of the emotion as well, but they don't know that they do. And then in humans, we know that we do, and we can talk about it, and we have concepts, and we can think about it as well. But all of these are distinct. And so, again, I think conflating these is still the number one problem in having a unified science of emotion. Right now, it's really completely split between psychologists studying humans, and they have very different views and different approaches to studying emotion, and people like my colleague at Caltech who work in animals, and they have very different approaches and ways of thinking about emotion. But if you think of them as states that are functionally defined and you bracket consciousness, like I said at the very first slide, at least methodologically, I think this is the place to start scientifically, because you can have objective definitions of how to approach them. You can say that they're there in animals or AIs, and you can study them. I just want to elaborate briefly on one more person, your colleague, Joe, who started with this paper, and since then he's published several other ones, in making the strong claim that we shouldn't use the word emotion in science. And his argument is fairly straightforward. He says we shouldn't use fear, anger, disgust, or the word emotion scientifically, because that means the conscious experience of emotion. When we use the word like fear or emotion, it just means the feeling. And we can't tell if animals have those feelings. We can't tell if they're conscious. And so this is not scientific, certainly when studying animal emotions. And I think it's easy to see, I hope it's easy to see by analogy why this is just misguided. For example, if I go to the person on the street, right, and I say, look, I'm studying vision, they would take me to be studying the experience of consciously seeing something. And most people who are vision scientists aren't interested in conscious experience at all. Or memory. If I tell the layperson, I'm a scientist, I work on memory, they think I work on the conscious experience of recollection. Same thing, we would say, well, we could educate them about non-declarative memory, right? So as scientists, we can use these folk psychological words that in the folk psychology have conscious experience mingled in with them. But as scientists, we can make the distinction, and we can certainly use all of these psychological concepts without having to contaminate them with necessarily with the study of consciousness. So the claim is do exactly the same for emotion. Study emotion, but divorce it from the conscious experience of emotion, just like you study vision and divorce it from the conscious experience of vision, like in blind sight, or memory and divorce it from the conscious recollection as in non-declarative memory. So then, if you do that, you can have a table like what's shown up here, which is all of these animals, according to David Anderson, even flies, would have an emotion state, and he would tell you how to tell. He would have behavioral criteria, he would put them in various conditions, he would show persistence and valence and approach behavior, he would say that it carries over to another task. There would be a list of purely behavioral criteria. He would then go into the brain, you could see here's the neural circuits that actually implement those, and you would find those, of course, the flies wouldn't have jealousy and love and awe, it would have a simpler set of emotions. But they would still have fly emotions, whatever they are, different from human emotions, but they would meet some of the same superordinate criteria. The conscious experience, again, you could leave this open, but presumably mammals at least have that, but none of them can think about emotion and have concepts for emotions in the way that humans would. So, but again, making distinctions between those rather than just saying, well, all of these things are emotion is essential. Otherwise, you're studying how people experience our emotions, or you're studying how people think about emotions, not emotions. Let me just put one last thing up here. Let me see how many slides, maybe not. I know there's wine and other things waiting back there. Okay, no, this can go pretty quick. So these are recent papers, one just published in Cell, another one's still in bioRxiv, battling an actual journal, from David Anderson's work. The claim that he's been making lately is that if you go into the brain and you record in sufficient detail, so these are actual, either calcium imaging or electrophysiological recordings of neurons, these brain structures, population level recordings, when an animal is in a state of anger or fear, etc. And he then analyzes those data and he uses dynamical systems modeling and finds that there's certain properties, like in this case, a line attractor that has some persistence, etc. And so his claim is that literally, just like we had the case with the lesion and intelligence case, where it was the actual implementation in the brain, white matter that connects processing, he would say the actual implementation in the neural activity shows characteristics like persistence and the way that you move around in a manifold when you look at this population level activity that literally recapitulates or corresponds to the functional properties that the emotion has. So this is the kind of a hard line view that would need to be more elaborated, but it literally says that while initially all of these psychological variables would be just functionally specified, and you could say they're in the brain, they're implemented in the brain, but they're actually individuated functionally. You would need to be a neuroscientist. He says, no, if you go into the brain and actually find how they work in the brain, this ultimately will be the level at which to explain it. And there's well-known reasons for doubting that this could work. You're probably all familiar with this paper from Conrad Kurting and colleagues, where they went through the exercise of taking a complex device, not as complex as a brain, but a microprocessor whose function by design was known. If you plug it in the right way into a machine, you play Atari video games. And they did what neuroscientists would do and reconstructed all the little transistors, and they lesioned them and looked at everything. And the claim is that even once you have that complete information about that device, you can't figure out what it's supposed to do. You would need to actually see how it works. And the same idea, the same thought for the brain, that you wouldn't be able to do this if you just had a brain in a vat. So the story so far here would be, what does neuroscience tell us? And I would agree that by itself, nothing, that you do need more, and you need behavior, and you probably ultimately need evolution. But you can certainly look at mechanisms if you already know, lose my point anywhere, quite a bit. As I mentioned at the beginning, if you have models to begin with, you can certainly use it to adjudicate. But the last one I wanted to quickly show in the last 5 minutes is, can you actually discover in a really data-driven way some of these variables? So I wanted to show a last thing here. I'll just skip straight to the thing. This is, there's code for Pythonized, nice Pythonized code that you could take a look at this GitHub here. This is in collaboration with my colleague Frederick Eberhardt, who's a causal modeling person at Caltech. And we hired, Caltech has a really nice program. If you're a CS major student and you've just graduated, before you go off and work for Google, there's actually this mechanism to give you some money and have you do software engineering for a lab. The lab has to, it's like a cost share thing. It still costs some money for us. But anyway, we hired these 2 students, and for a couple of years, they put this together. If you want to look it up, it's called Causal Feature Learning. The basic, I'll just go through the basic idea and only give you a glimpse of the data because it's still very much work in progress. But it's been published for, I think the GitHub has papers. It's been published not for neural data, but for climate data. We have tons of samples. So you can predict El Nino in a completely data-driven way with this. The basic idea is very simple. You have micro-level data. So in this case, you would have brain lesions or voxels in the brain or whatever it is. And on the behavioral end, you would have item-wise responses or trial-wise behavior from a person. And then normally, right, if you take the Neo 5-factor inventory, the personality inventory, there's like on the short form at least, there's like 60 questions, there's 5, personality dimensions, there's 12 items per personality factor, and it tells you how to score it and add them up, right? And that's it. And same thing with the brain. You normally do something just over here, which can be unsupervised, but you derive resting state networks or you use regions of interest to aggregate these most microscopic level data. So this algorithm aggregates them, so they're not independently aggregated, but so they're aggregated in a way that whatever the macro level neural system is, and whatever the macro level behavioral psychological variable is, have the maximal causal relation between each other. So again, it's there. You can take a look, but it's very nice in 2 respects. One is it's completely unsupervised. It's totally data driven, but it's unlike, and we've shown this, it's unlike doing unsupervised clustering on each of these left and right sides independently. You don't get the same. If I just do, like what you said, I do PCA on the brain data, and I do something similar on the individual items of a personality questionnaire, I don't get what this gives you, because this has the constraint that there needs to be a causal relation. So that's the basic idea of it. In this case, what we applied it to so far for the brain data, we did a little bit with fMRI, but too complicated. They're not enough samples. But we have done it with lesion data, where again, we have lesions all over the brain. We want to put them together in such a way that they would have the strongest causal relation to all the behavioral data we have available. I'll skip the details here. We did that to show that it works in the case of language and visual spatial processing. And we basically recapitulate what you would find. So in this case, so basically what it does is it gives you 5 modes here. So you could think of it, if you're familiar with this, for any other method that have 2 multivariate data sets that you want to relate in a more compressed way. So it's like an autoencoder, or if you do canonical correlation analysis would probably be the most common one. But canonical correlation analysis just simply is an optimization to find, the sort of most compressed representation in the middle. It doesn't have none of these methods have any claims about causal relation, which this does. So anyway, it works in the sense that it recapitulates, language is on the left, visual spatial processing is on the right. So it gives us those. And then I know this is incomprehensible in its detail, and that's good because I'm not giving you the detail. We've done it for the affect depression inventory and also the Minnesota multiphasic personality inventory. So you take these, batteries where there's a whole bunch of items, and there's a standard way of scoring them, or you could do something unsupervised. You could do factor analysis or PCA or something, but this looks different. Here you're actually asking the variation that I get in the brain lesions. How does that map onto clustering the items, in this case on the BDI, in a way that I can make causal claims between those 2? And you get interpretable relations, but they're different from what you would get if you did each individually. So I just wanted, I know I glossed over this in a huge way, but I wanted to highlight this as one method that we've been thinking about conceptually, coming back to the pictures I showed at the very beginning. We think there should be a causal relation, not just some kind of association between the brain and the behavioral measures here. And that's what this CFL algorithm builds in. Last slide. So I started out with this, and again, I want to just reiterate, I think I mentioned it in passing, that this picture and the debates that I've had about emotion with people are, my claim is that this is the way to move forward towards a productive, integrated science. It doesn't claim to be, to solve everything and to be complete. In particular, I certainly think that consciousness and all these other questions are relevant. It's just that I don't think we should start there to begin with the science. And so the conscious experience, you can investigate that separately. I think you should completely divorce that from emotion, personality, intelligence, anything else, at least in the first instance. And then, of course, there's lots of normative constraints that if you build, a model of the mind, there's nothing in here that says this, this is rational or that has anything to do with moral responsibility. So again, I just want to close by assuring you that you might think this is a very dry or even in some sense behaviorist program I'm pushing here. I think it's methodologically useful, and all of the points that I've made here make it so that the science in humans, science of psychology, science of the mind, at least for the variables I spoke about, could be much better integrated between humans and other animals. But again, I acknowledge it's not going to be complete. There's more. So I just want to end with that.
Very much that. So we'll take questions.
It's done.
Yeah.
Well,
I would encourage you to ask conceptual questions. This is not, a data research talk.
sorry about my question then.
A normal question, that's fine too.
Great talk. It's very nice to see the overview that you give of the field. I was just curious, actually. When you talk about personality, in a way, it's the way we interact with the world, interact with like stimuli. And then you go and use essentially resting state data to try to get at these concepts. What is your thought on exactly that task that you use, and do you think that it would be different? Let's say if you were to look at data where people, I don't know, like interact with affective images or images of social interaction and all that. My point is, do you think that you will get all the signal that you need to associate with personality in resting state data?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I mean, obviously, there's limitations to the data. The reason for looking at the brain is that, again, while I think that all of these psychological variables are functionally defined, ultimately, that is, you could construct everything based on behavior alone. You wouldn't need to look at the brain. It's in the brain. And the brain, unless you have a complete inventory of behavior in all possible environments, which you would never have, the brain would give you insight. So the basic picture would be, again, aliens come down, right? And you see a whole bunch of little biological things moving around, and you keep measuring stuff, and you try and figure out, how are these working? You're going to get a bunch of psychological models. Unless you're already contaminated with the concept of consciousness, none of those will have consciousness in them, which is good, I think. And they will be predictive models, but they will be non-unique, right? You have multiple models that do equally well because the behavior isn't everything. It's not possible. So going into the brain will help you to tell apart which of these models are more or less convincing. So with the resting state data, to the extent you don't find anything, you're right. It might just be, SNR is bad, the samples are small, there's lots of technical reasons. But to the extent that you do find something more specific, it would be one piece of evidence that could weigh you, in one way or the other. That particular networks, particular parts of the brain, particular personality factors have more reality than others. If you use this metric that I mentioned on the behavioral end, that is, which is how people think about it. That is, in the first instance, conceptually, what you want personality to be is something that is a trait, that is temporally stable. Resting state data would be a good place to start. You don't want an activation task where there's a state change from one moment to the next. Or if you did, you would want to regress those out and say what's consistent across all the different states is my personality. That doesn't change, right? Right now, I might be anxious, then I might be tired, then I might be depressed, but my personality, that would be the claim, should be constant across all of those state changes. So in the full model, right, you would take, for example, resting state on many, many, many different time points, and you would get many different questionnaires of how the person feels at those different time points, and you would build a model that has both the trait level and the state level changes. And people have done things like that. Sam Gershman just had a paper recently where he just behaviorally modeled variability across time in a whole bunch of subjects and built a model like that, that you have this, basically hierarchical setup. There are variables at the top that are temporally stable that define you as a person, like personality and intelligence. And then there are ones that are state variables, like your momentary emotion, and they're related, right? But you think resting state data would be a good place. You would think anatomical data would be good to start for personality, if only the right measures. So since it's temporally stable, that would be temporally stable. Yeah,
That's perfect. Questions? Yeah.
I'm just curious about neuroticism in particular, because we showed results here you couldn't be predicted where is that that work. But there was a paper by Val and team in UK Board where they had tested, I believe, up to 30,000 subjects in both structural and functional, and they weren't able to predict neuroticism. But I also believe that associated mental health quite strongly, so it is a thing. And the thing we assume has to do with our mental, I don't know, cerebral structure to some degree, but somehow we cannot predict it. What do we do with that? Do we suggest we just throw it in the bin? It's just like a useless measure, and we say, boo, or is there like some kind of like, I don't know, brain dark matter that it doesn't seem?
right. Okay. Well, I mean, there's a lot of things in what you said. First of all, the UK Biobank imaging data is the functional imaging data is absolute crap, so you don't want to use that. The structural, okay, you can use that. The behavioral data is also mostly crap. I mean, we've analyzed it, and so you can do, we've published on it, but you can use it. But the advantage is a very large sample size, but you have to take a very close look at the actual measures. So to the extent that you don't find something, or you do find something, either way, in the UK Biobank, I would say you have to be extremely careful. The only advantage, well, there's two advantages: large sample size, and it is very broad and lots of biomedical measures. But coming back to the main core of your question, well, the thought would be if there's a construct that's useful, for instance, clinically, but you just cannot find any evidence for it by approaching it from any biological angle, then you should think of an alternative, at least if you want to incorporate it into a future science. That's, ultimately, you would hope that psychology doesn't have heterogeneous domains of variables, some of which are in the brain and some of which are not. That's like a complete, then you have multiple sciences, which you do have. You have cognitive psychology and social psychology and clinical psychology. But the thought is, can we integrate them? I mean, they all purport to be about the mind in some broad sense. And so I guess the project here is to try to see if we can integrate them, at least and again, the claim is in the first instance, you need to bracket some things and bring it together. But the claim would be that you should search for and try to find evidence in the brain that these psychological variables are actually realized in the brain. And if you have alternatives and you find that one scheme is and another is not, that would be in favor of the scheme that's realized in the brain, both for the sort of ontological conceptual reasons that I mentioned at the beginning, but also just methodologically, right? You would want to be able to use neuroscience as one of the sciences in order to both diagnose and intervene on psychiatric illness, for instance, right? So again, I think the overarching theme here is some kind of scientific unification, not in the sense of reduction, but in the sense that there should be relations between the sciences so you can talk about shared variables in some way, which is currently, for all the examples I gave, and especially for emotion, really missing. The people that say they work on emotion, and there's people that say they work on emotion, and they're working on completely different things, and they think that the type of data that the other person uses is invalid, and that's just a disaster for the science of emotion.
But could it be that the definition of neuroticism is elusive and ill-defined and do that to the brain? So, for example, that it would have subcomponents that if you could split it into something.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't go into, I glossed over a lot of stuff here, but so you might not know this, but how these were defined, neuroticism, extroversion, etc., is from just a lexical analysis. They took words, the word that people use to describe personality, and they did a factor analysis just on the meanings of the words. And that's how you get the 5 factors. Then they did more. So it's not that they stopped there. They said, well, this is just how people think about personality. But it turns out it correlates with, lots of clinical behavioral outcomes, et cetera, et cetera. So this gave people some confidence that these were not just purely made up, but they actually had some reality. So again, it's not completely useless, but the question is, can you do better? And I think, yes, so there are other dimensional schemes for personality, just like the competing emotion theories that I had at the very, very beginning. The competing theories, we need to go and say, okay, which one has the better evidence, and come up with criteria for how to decide between them. But at least one source of evidence, again, with lots of caveats, should be evidence from neuroscience, that you find evidence that some of these are actually implemented. In the ideal case, you would find evidence for how they work in the brain. You would find that this fits how they develop in infants and children. You would find evidence how this has evolved, and you would find, parts of this also in dogs and cats, and rodents, etc. So you would have, again, some unified science that includes the biology together with the neuroscience and the psychology. Again, I don't claim that one should reduce to the other, but they need to relate. And right now, that's not the case for a lot of these. So again, there's non-unique ways of looking at the mind from the perspective of psychology. We should generate alternative hypotheses, but then you need to test them with data from other sciences, with the objective being to try to keep trying to think of the right word, to integrate them in the sense that the sciences should be able to talk to one another, not subsume one another.
I just got back from sabbatical at USC in LA, and I had the opportunity to discuss with Antonio Damasio his theory of consciousness related to homeostatic feelings, being like an overall event in evolution that led to the rise of consciousness. And I was curious to see, with respect to your experience and research on emotions and the fact that there is distinctions, emotions, feelings, but sometimes also some overlap. And this is maybe more of a discussion for later on over wine, but I was just curious of your take on that theory of consciousness that draws specifically on homeostatic feelings.
Yeah, I mean, look, so I mean, just very quickly, I think consciousness is a super important, respectable topic for sure. It's super hard. B, I think all the main theories are good candidates, so I don't think any one of them is pseudoscience, for example. And C, I don't particularly favor any one of them. I think they're all candidates. We need to do exactly what I said here. So if this is your program, you want to have a science of consciousness. They're doing exactly what I was talking here. That has come up with, neuroscience data, biology data related to other sciences. So it's not just off on its own, and try and triangulate on. But that's one metric that people are using, right? Can we build something that relates to other sciences, and as such, that gives us hypotheses we can test experimentally using, for example, the tools of neuroscience, like the adversarial studies do, right? With respect to Damasio's, I like the approach. I think a lot of these, frankly, are not necessarily inconsistent with one another. Even IIT and global workspace theory, even though they're pitted as being inconsistent. I think Damasio's theory is nice in the sense of it has some appeal, it has some introspective plausibility, and then it has just extreme, well, IIT is extreme too, but it has lots of phylogenetic continuity. So you would say, Damasio would say, it's already there, in bacteria, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a story that, in his view, links life and the regulation of life, homeostasis, to consciousness. So I like that in the sense that it tries to, all of these theories to some extent of consciousness do that. They try to take some other phenomenon and say consciousness is this, right? It's working memory, a global workspace, or it's phi, it's whatever. And once you have that, you bring consciousness out of wherever it is and make it tractable and studyable. I think the main difficulty with all of these, but Damasio's in particular, it's not obvious, well, all of them really, it's not obvious that at the end of the day, you won't still have, people like David Chalmers saying, sure, this is a nice theory of homeostasis, or a nice theory of working memory, but I can imagine a zombie having everything that you just said and they're not conscious, right? And the response then would presumably be, well, once I have enough evidence, then you're really just left with this tiny thing where you're just insisting, no, but I can really think of everything here that the qualia aren't there, but you have no experiment that could tell them apart. And then I think you would really be pushed into a corner. So it's early on, I think. I hope he develops or he has people what would be nice is for Damasio, to have more people that would buy into his theory and start thinking about it and start, doing this. You don't hear too much about it. I mean, I don't think he goes to ASSC, for instance, and not that represented. So I would like to see that theory. I think it's a useful theory that should be represented on a par with, higher order theories, recurrent processing, global workspace theory, IIT, all the other candidates out there. I mean, need them all.
Well, thank you very much.